Hello, my name is Melissa Wybrow, Marketing Manager, and welcome to IBA's Rapid Response session on how to protect your asset value. I'm joined by Phil Seymour, IBA's President. Welcome, Phil.
Hello.
And I'm also joined by Ross Armour, Senior Technical Manager. Hello, Ross.
Hi, everyone.
Ross is stepping in for Peter Walter, who has not been able to join us today, so a slight change to the advertised lineup. So with the unprecedented challenges that our industry is facing, we hope this short session will provide some guidance and insight around steps needed to protect and maintain asset values over the coming months. Phil and Ross are going to be looking at storing aircraft, maintaining value, when it goes wrong, what to do, and managing unscheduled redeliveries. So let's get started. Phil, I believe you're going to kick off.
Yeah, hello, everyone. I've been asked, we've seen a few downturns in the past, is this one any different? And of course, this does seem to be different. I'm referring back to some of the issues we saw: 1991, First Gulf War, 9/11, SARS 2003, and GFC. They did all have one thing in common, and of course that was overcapacity. Airlines had to choose which aircraft to park, which ones to put into longer term storage, and in fact many aircraft leases and purchase agreements were cancelled. So those experiences, we're going to be talking through some of those today, and that's why we thought we should have a prompt advisory webinar to put you in the picture as to things that we've seen happen before and currently what we're doing with some of the clients who we have management contracts with. So moving on to the slide headed, why do aircraft need to be stored correctly and what's at risk? Well, clearly here, aircraft and records have to comply with certain regulatory requirements. We know that we're in a highly regulated industry. Safety is what it's all about. So storing an aircraft, there are procedures for it, which are just as important as flying an aircraft. That's in the engineering and maintenance sense. Compliance with the OEM procedures is key. We're already looking at long-term storage issues, particularly because of the grounding of the MAX. But hopefully we won't be in such a prolonged period. But there are certain procedures that do need to be followed that we're going to be discussing today. But it's not just about the procedures. You obviously need to have adequate personnel and equipment to perform those tasks, and obviously that could be under threat. The procedures will vary according to length of storage, and we're going to talk about some of those issues in the next half an hour. But the benefits, clearly the benefits are that you really have to do this because aircraft can be brought back into service much more rapidly than if they're ignored, and then you have to go back and sort things out retrospectively. But significantly here, it is really about value. If an aircraft isn't properly stored and properly certified, there can be a huge impact on value. We put a warning in red font here. Proper storage isn't a choice. Value will be negatively impacted if not properly performed. The worst case could be aircraft and engines needing to undergo heavy maintenance checks and or shop visits in order to show the regulatory authorities that there have been no gaps or no problems that could have been incurred during that storage period if it's not been performed correctly. So just putting some numbers on that, I suppose a typical narrow body, if there were gaps in records or storage procedures not performed correctly and you had to perform a 6 or 12 year check, that could be at least a couple of $1 million, and for each engine that could be a couple of $1 million again. So putting it into perspective, if the aircraft isn't stored properly, you could end up with a $6 million bill to get things recertified, and that of course would have to be done at a time when you probably want that aircraft back on the market. But the issue here is there could be situations where banks or lessors are faced with taking aircraft back in the next few months, and ensuring that they've been properly certified is really going to impact the potential to move that aircraft on. So I'll move on to the next slide now, and introducing Ross a little bit more. Ross has been with us for several years, and I think Ross previous airlines, Virgin Atlantic. So you've worked for the airline industry. Perhaps I shouldn't say that you were a poacher and now you've turned gamekeeper. So some of these planning of storage considerations, Ross, what's your view on those?
I've seen both sides of the coin on this one. I've been in airlines where we've had to park and store aircraft and seen the implications and the difficulties in that post 9/11. Those issues back then were kind of shorter term, as in a return to service was on the horizon, whereas currently we're without a crystal ball. We can't really see how and when this situation is going to remedy itself. So it's key to get the right storage programs in place for aircraft that are not flying.
And that could vary, couldn't it? So I think we've seen situations where some airlines, it's not actually uniform across the fleet. They might actually say, well, these aircraft we may not need for 3 or 4 months, but these aircraft we might just have lower utilization. So it's going to be, if you financed an aircraft, you really want to know which category the airline is putting that aircraft into. Is that fair?
Sure. What we saw post 9/11 with the aging types, the 3-engined aircraft, they were the first to be parked and never to return to service. It's possible we may see same trends with 4-engine type aircraft, with fleet restructuring post this crisis, but there's still no light at the end of the tunnel yet.
No, it's that uncertainty that means, I think from our perspective, we really want to be saying, if you're taking worst case, then this could drag on for a few months. That's why the storage program is crucial. I mean, will these aircraft be, I don't know what sort of Virgin are doing at the moment. Is things being parked at Heathrow and Gatwick? Do you think they'll be looking at alternative airfields?
Sure. We've seen aircraft movements around Europe to the more remote airfields, places like Prestwick. The implications with those regional airfields is the support isn't there as a main base. We've seen, Lufthansa parking large fleet at Munich, Cathay Pacific, obviously Hong Kong, running out of space. Those difficulties that poses to the maintenance program, the storage program, is real world in terms of access. Parking aircraft on taxiways makes it very difficult to even get to the aircraft without having an escort. And then how do you get the tooling, the steps and the equipment out to those remote places on the airfield? And if you're parking aircraft at remote airfields where you don't have a presence, how do you get your staff access? Airside passes for personnel, airside passes for vehicles. Those implications can take time to set up themselves.
Yeah, we've a couple of aircraft we've got under management. We've been asking the airlines, where the particular aircraft is parked. A couple of those aren't at what I would call the airline's main base. So then, it's really following up about what available resources available at that alternative airfield, because these checks have to go on, and we're going to go into the detail of what may be required when an aircraft enters storage or goes along. But also, Ross, one of the things I was concerned about was that we're talking, airlines are saying they want staff to take unpaid leave, and I can understand why perhaps pilots and cabin crew may not be required, but technical staff, planners, record keepers, and the maintenance crews to do those checks. That must be one of the difficulties right now.
Yeah, I mean, as we've seen with the large scale temporary layoffs and the unpaid work that's being rolled out across the industry, really, how are these operators going to manage these storage checks efficiently and correctly with a reduction in numbers of staff? Don't forget, the airlines aren't in the business of storing airplanes, they're in the business of operating airplanes. So the nuances of storing aircraft is quite different to turning around an aircraft and operationally using one. We also are keenly aware that lots of large operators do not have in-house maintenance capabilities or staff. They outsource the entirety of their engineering. Now, those operators, if they're financially struggling prior to this outbreak, how are they going to pay the bills to the maintenance providers to ensure the aircraft are stored correctly? Because we've seen it before where an airline's ceased trading and the aircraft have been away from base, and the maintenance provider at that station has said, well, we're not getting paid, so we'll park the aircraft, and it's just been left and abandoned effectively, which makes it very difficult to return to service when you do want to move it.
And of course, because that whole supply chain is affected, there will be situations where, let's say, an airport or an MRO is already owed for previous maintenance and will want, some kind of assurance that that's being paid. So I think there's an awful lot of conversations and positioning going on, because potentially, an airline could already be in default on an MRO contract. We've been talking about how the airline may need to restructure its leasing and financings, but actually the supply chain, which affects this subject, which is storage, is huge, because airports may look at this and say, great, we've now got some collateral here. We're owed a lot of money, and it's great that that aircraft isn't flying away. We've actually got possession of it. So it's putting airlines in a particularly vulnerable situation.
And of course, you need the support of the airfield to carry out the maintenance, the storage tasks. So the airport authorities can hold the aircraft at ransom in effect by saying, well, unless you pay the storage fees and the parking fees and the landing fees, you're not having access to the aircraft to carry out any maintenance, which could become an issue.
I hope that, we saw in previous downturns, to some extent, it can bring out the best of businesses, and we would expect to see, the parking charges at Heathrow and in particular in the major airports, imagine like of Frankfurt and Schiphol in Amsterdam, are pretty much the same. It can be thousands of dollars per hour. So clearly that is something where there must be some either government support or just reasonableness on the part of the airport providers. But that's why this is affecting all kinds of sectors. But there's in terms of that maintenance resource, these checks we're going to be talking about, they're not hugely intensive, but they do require access. They require let's say covers for the engines and things. And I don't think any airline has a full set of engine covers.
No, for example. If you took a large fleet like British Airways and looked at their requirements for blankings and covers and engine covers, that resource would take up an entire building on its own. So airlines don't house that. We used to see airlines carrying those kits as a flyaway kit, but lots of operators took them out because they were carrying them, and there was a fuel penalty to carry that kit around. So lots of those were removed. The other thing, touching back on the base maintenance for storage, the storage tasks themselves are mainly man-hour driven with low-cost consumables to carry out the program. There is deep paneling and some more enhanced access required if it's longer-term storage. The 145, the maintenance provider, they have some limitations on what tasks they can perform at our stations. They can't carry out big, heavy maintenance tasks. Should something go wrong or something need rectifying, they are limited to what they can do away from base.
And that would probably need a ferry flight back to a maintenance base at some point.
Possibly,
aircraft are not really designed to sit down on the ground, and as we're going to cover here, fuel leaks can develop, systems leakages because systems aren't being used. So it's going to lead to
simple
some
things like
issues.
hydraulic leaks, which in service are acceptable. We have limits on leaks. Some leaks are acceptable, but if you park an aircraft with that leak, what detrimental damage could that cause to the aluminiums or the composite panels? In service, those leaks are acceptable, but during storage, they can present real problems.
On this last point here, it was really bringing out the record keeping side that I'd already mentioned in the introduction that, you know, gaps in storage programs can delay the recertification and re-entry to service. And I think hopefully, you know, the questions we're asking the airlines, again, the aircraft that we're managing, is, you know, what staff are being retained. Obviously, it's one thing with an airline managing and looking for people on unpaid leave, but let's face it, we're talking about coronavirus here. So you know, there could be a situation where your ideal personnel actually aren't available. So yeah, I think there are some very practical issues.
Yeah, I mean, we keep looking at this situation like we did with parking aircraft during 9/11 and you know, the financial crisis. But in those times, we had full support. Yes, there was layoffs retrospectively after the dust had settled, but during this period, you know, schools on lockdown and parents having to stay at home, you know, those implications do have real world impact in record keeping and maintaining these storage programs.
Yeah, I can see those airlines who have online record systems maybe at some advantage here anyway.
Yeah,
but
sure.
There's still plenty of what I call the old-fashioned airlines who require a tech records clerk to be manually inputting items.
Obviously, we deliver aircraft ourselves and do lots of transitions, so our interest in records is quite extensive. The thing with this period, everyone's aware of this grounding, so in years to come, people can look at this section of time and delve into those section of records and see if there's any shortfalls.
Yeah.
Which, retrospectively, what can you do about it? Not a lot, but it could become a commercial type bargaining chip of, you know, for future operators or owners.
Yeah, I was going to sort of touch on that point a bit later, but potentially we could see OEMs being asked to adjust maintenance programs to, you know, if an aircraft hasn't actually been utilised for a few months, could maintenance checks be delayed? But we can come back to that. I think I'm keen to move on to some of the detail here, Ross. What are the entry into storage checks? Don't need to do a deep dive into everything, but it would make sense just to run through some of these sorts of things that happen before, when the decision is made to say, right, that aircraft won't be flying for 6 weeks or 2 months.
Yeah.
You know, what sorts of things?
Well, I mean, we're still looking at this as a short-term storage issue rather than the long-term. However, it could develop into a long-term at this stage. The general visual inspections pre-storage, you know, confirming the dent and buckle to ensure no damage is incurred during the storage that is missed, and the aircraft departs as and when it does with damage. As I touched on earlier, with the hydraulic leaks or fuel leaks, they can be acceptable in service but can present real problems during storage. Serving oxygen and all systems. The aircraft maintenance manual will detail every task such as these things, but the off-airport storage places like fuel, draining fuel, where does that fuel go? When you're at a remote station, you can't dispose of things like that. Water and waste, emptying systems, it's difficult when you're not at a main base. And servicing systems during the check, the lubrication, flight controls, nitrogen, oxygen systems, where is all that resource? Is that resource available? Inhibiting fuel tanks with biocide. Each operator has to be aware of how much fuel is on board the aircraft, because there's limits on a minimum amount of fuel, then you add the biocide. So it's no good landing at an airport that doesn't have refueling capabilities for your type and then needing fuel to carry out the storage tasks.
So that we refer to it as BioBore. I think there might be a trade name, but it basically stops the, does that stop the fungal growth?
It's microbiological growth, yeah.
Cladospora and resinae, I think.
Correct,
I seem to remember from my apprentice days, which can attack the structure in the fuel tanks and cause corrosion.
Yeah, there's quite enhanced checks for in-service aircraft regarding microbiological growth, but it will be more prevalent during storage. You know, that's when you're susceptible to it.
Yeah, and the things like obviously water drains. There is a natural, because of condensation, changes in temperature and humidity, water will be created within the tanks. And
Sure.
as you probably know, water being heavier than fuel will sink to the bottom of the tank. So I might be teaching grandma how to suck eggs here, but that is a very important thing, that water drain checks still need to be performed to prevent corrosion.
That's a key part of the storage program checks.
On preservation of engines, any idea, is that just a couple of hours? Is that pumping the fuel system with a preservation oil?
For short-term storage, it's a simple enough task. It's obviously a very important task because the engines do not preserve well unless they're stored correctly. Keeping seals and moving parts moving is how a jet engine works best. So short-term storage, anything up to 30 days, the tasks for preserving the engines are quite simple and limited, but anything more than 30 days, then we look at adding inhibitors to oil systems, fuel systems, which becomes a task in itself, but de-preserving the engines at the end of the storage is more complex than preserving them.
Yeah, obviously applying covers to anything that's open. So obviously the engine intakes, engine exhausts, but there's other things like pedostatic tubes, outflow valves. I mean, that's just really, is that as simple as tape and plastic covers on those sorts of things?
Most maintenance manuals will say if you don't have manufactured covers available, you can create your own covers. We've seen in the past, but it's obviously not as helpful as manufactured covers. And we have seen a shortage of covers where some things aren't covered, and then you may incur more maintenance tasks at the return to service, especially with the pedostatic system, where if you haven't protected them, it's probably prudent to flush the system prior to return the aircraft to service. So those are tasks that aren't in the maintenance manual, but you would probably go to the OEM to ask, we haven't stored it correctly because we didn't have the covers. What do we need to do?
Yeah, we've seen also things like cabin safety equipment, sometimes fire extinguishers, oxygen bottles, that type of things being removed from the aircraft. But I imagine that would be the longer term stuff rather than...
It is in the storage program for the short term as well, depending on type of aircraft and the maintenance manual, but we do see the demand for removing those items, which at main base isn't a problem because you have a quarantine stores, you know, you have the capability to recertify some of those items. But if you're at an off airfield airport where you're not based, where do you store those when you do remove them from the aircraft? Because you don't have a facility there. Do you ship them back to main base, which leaves the aircraft without those items? And if you were unfortunate enough to see a failure in the airline, you know, where do those items get lost in translation, basically?
I mean, here we are, I suppose, you know, Northern Hemisphere, springtime. Hopefully we won't get any more snowfall in the UK. But obviously there are aircraft parked in some parts of the world where the weather, you know, could be an influencer. And of course, we still could see some low pressure systems coming across the Atlantic here. We're not quite out of the winter season yet.
It is a global crisis that we're in, so we will see aircraft being stored in not in the least ideal environments. The maintenance manuals do specify for those types of environments. There's an interesting one I've been reading about in regards to the humidity within the cabin. If the cabin is more than 70% humidity, they stipulate you must remove all of the seats and all of the carpets. I mean, that is a massive undertaking on any aircraft. Never mind a wide body. So making sure the ground equipment to heat the cabins are available would be how you would remedy it. But when you've got multiple jets parked across continents, how do you make sure that resource is available to service those needs?
I mean, there's probably not enough ground power units in the world to do that. Maybe that's a new business opportunity out there we should look at. But in terms of the ongoing checks during the storage regime, can you just sort of run through some of these? I know we mentioned some of the points there, but you can't just, you can't just ignore your aircraft for 3 months then.
Certainly not. As I said before, the aircraft maintenance manual details every aspect of what needs to be undertaken to achieve these storage programs in compliance with the manufacturer. Initial storage review, when you put the aircraft into service, whether you are a third party going to have a look at your aircraft that is in storage, it can tell you a lot about how the aircraft will cope, on the ground for an extended period of time. Box ticking exercise of, yes, everything is in place and everything does look good. The follow-up to that would be reviewing the storage cards that the maintenance provider sign and stamp to make sure compliance is achieved. These can be done digitally. You can stamp the work cards, then you could send them to the owner for review and peace of mind, effectively.
Yeah, I think once, I mean, we're not saying here that these are hugely manpower intensive, a weekly walk round looking for obvious things like leaks, corrosion. And then we see, we were looking at the A320 maintenance manual a couple of days ago, and there are then sort of specific things at 15 days and 30 days. But nevertheless, you can see if you've got a fleet of 50 A320s or 737s on the ground, even if it's only, it would still take one person all week just to be looking around. And then if they find a problem, what are they going to do about rectifying it? So I think these sorts of things are a key. The other one, of course, is the tracking of ongoing maintenance items. So a lot of calendar items will become expired. It could be, I'm just thinking of, we were talking about fire extinguishers. They often have a date for the testing and ultimate replacement. I'm assuming airlines won't bother replacing it, but clearly they have to keep a record of which items are expired and then addressing those when they come back into service. I mean,
the hard time component listing associated with each aircraft will give you those definitive dates and times, and hopefully we all have enough resource in-house to keep an eye on those items. The other aspect is items that are already carried by the aircraft, such defects that are in the minimum equipment listing. They have calendar due dates. Now, if you land at a remote aircraft with an item that's already deferred, that may expire within the period of the storage. So when you want to return the aircraft to service, you will have to rectify that defect before you can. So if it is something large, it could be a stopper for a long period of time before you can.
I was looking at a survey, one of the MRO in the MRO sector. One of the publications was running a survey on, do you think there will be a demand on MRO services now because airlines will bring maintenance forward, or do you think airlines will be deferring maintenance? The last time I looked at the results of that, there was a very heavy bias towards airlines not doing work. And I mean, that makes sense. If you're trying to preserve cash, then why would you do maintenance? I think that there are times when an airline will perform opportunity maintenance, but right now I think the uncertainty means there'll be less rather than more. But also, meanwhile, on the there will still be service bulletins, will still be being issued by vendors and OEMs. We're still likely to see airworthiness directives being issued based on previous engineering results going into the OEMs. So it is imperative that the resources are still available at the airlines to keep ahead of those continuous airworthiness management issues.
I mean, that again touches on the same problem with the minimum equipment listing deferred defects, is airworthiness directives that require compliance within the next 30 days or 60 days. If you're at a remote airfield, the compliance for that AD may mean removing, parts of structure to gain access to assess and comply with the AD. It's possible you can get dispensation to ferry it with that AD open, but you'll have to comply when you get back to main base.
Yeah. What are the next slide is sort of looking at the, what happens when this market comes back, because we're all hoping that it'll happen in a matter of weeks rather than months. What are the key points here then, Ross, in terms of making sure that passengers can, happily jump on an aircraft after it's been parked up for 3 months? What sort of things need to be performed?
Sure. The depreservation as a whole is basically undoing everything we did to preserve it. It can be simple in many respects, because we don't have to apply lubrications and those sort of items. However, when things do go wrong with aircraft, it's inevitably when they've been on the ground for a long period of time, and the gremlins get into the systems. If you're at a remote airfield or away from main base and you apply the power, if something's going to go wrong, it may be during that period. If you'll have to do post storage engine runs. Are you going to incur problems there? What liabilities might we face when we're returning the aircraft to service, but we're away from main base?
I suppose practically speaking, this tap isn't going to be turned on to full on day one. Whenever that happens, there will be slowly but surely aircraft will return to service. So I'd like to think that there'll be this will be a well managed process. I think already, if I go back to the MAX situation, there was already a lot of questions being asked about how rapidly the stored MAXes will return to service. Obviously, that was even before coronavirus, so that's a double challenge now. But some of those aircraft have been stored for over a year now, almost, and it'll be, that one of the questions we had of a couple of operators of the MAX was how they'd be handling the ETOPS side. Just to clarify for those who don't know, obviously ETOPS is extended twin engine operations. Obviously, if you're basically flying over water or you don't have an alternative airfield, there are sort of limitations on how far away you can be from alternative airfield. So it could be obviously an aircraft that is primarily flying across an ocean. If it's been stored for 3 or 4 months, there may be the need for some additional checks or perhaps even a demo flight before that's released for ETOPS.
Sure.
But again, that I should clarify, we have put notes at the bottom of these slides. We hope people don't go away and certify according to IBA's webinar. We are expecting certification to take place in accordance with the aircraft maintenance manual. But those are really some of the areas that we're addressing for aircraft we're currently managing. I was going to move on now then to being prepared for a repossession. For those of you who've been following our webinars, you may notice we've changed some of the operators now, because unfortunately we have over here in the UK, we have a domestic operator, Flybe, just as recent as a couple of weeks ago. It seems a lot longer than that to me now, ceasing operations, and we're waiting to see how that develops. But it is, this is really uncanny. I know IBA as a company, when we're advising on management of assets, we always talk about having a contingency plan in place. And for the aircraft we manage, we've had those contingencies in place. And I'd be, even when we've looked at some of the top tier carriers, we've always said to those investors or funds, you should take nothing for granted. What would happen if airline X goes out of business? where would aircraft be moved to, how would they be stored and certified. So I don't want to sit here smugly saying I told you so, but actually we're getting a lot of calls now about, you know, the what if scenario, and obviously flag carriers are in amongst that list. It's not just those that have been, you know, sort of bumbling along for the last couple of years, but I think here, you know, a lot of these, you know, we can share with you lots of the situations we've seen in the past, but it is really now is a time to, you know, start planning. What, you know, who is your legal advisor, who would practically, you know, help you take possession of those aircraft? How would you be collating the records? What's the chance of moving these aircraft onto another operator? So at the moment, I mean, from what, you know, we're seeing ourselves, but also talking to colleagues in the industry, you can imagine an airline which has multiple lessors, and some airlines we've seen may have up to 30 lessors of aircraft that they're leasing. Keeping the airline keeping that resource in place is crucial to keep the exposed lessors and banks up to speed with what's going on, because as we all know, it's a lack of information causes big issues. But there are some practical issues here, Ross, and I was going to ask you about, you know, where we say, well, you know, we glibly say, well, get a team on the ground, but actually coronavirus is here. How, you know, there are some real practical issues here about getting a team on the ground becomes a practical issue.
There certainly are. We're fortunate that most regions we do have in-house teams around the world, so we do have that capacity to service our guys who are under asset management currently. The real world implications of getting access to aircraft during a repossession are complex. You know, getting access to an airport as a person trying to repossess an aircraft is difficult in itself, and having people in the region does make it slightly easier, you know, rather than a foreigner arriving and requesting access. People with national cards, as we see in India, there's foreigners aren't allowed an airside pass for it takes 60 days to get an access pass, so nationals can get in within a day or two. So those difficulties can be unforeseen. You know, get a team on the ground is our first thought, but there are difficulties around that.
I mean, basically, you know, we were asked whether we could get somebody into Milan Linate Airport. Well, no, not even our local person is really going to be knocking on the door of that airport right now. But then we have other, you know, practical aspects like, you know, where are the titled engines? You know, airlines can, you know, move these engines around as they wish, or should I say in accordance with the lease agreement. So we're still managing some Jet Airways situations. We're managing a 777 at Schiphol right now, and I think we've only just about managed to organise the engine change on that. So there are some practical issues, and I think those will just sort of get worse in the coming weeks, at least in Europe. And you know, we're seeing further lockdowns or lack of movement in the US, and we expect that to continue for some weeks. In terms of the you know, alternative scenario planning, and again, we've got a current situation where we were hoping to ferry fly an aircraft from Europe to the USA for a cargo conversion, but we've had to really put that on hold because we've got, in this particular case, we've got EU flight crews, but they're concerned about will they get back into their homeland, because it's going to take a while to ferry the turboprop aircraft across. But there are definitely some considerations on that repossession, but right now I think the emphasis is on making sure that the asset is being protected, and then work on a contingency plan in the coming days or weeks. I want to move on to the slide that's headed banks and financiers, and yeah, ultimately this is slightly different, than a lessor's aircraft here, because lessors, historically are pretty proactive in the management of their assets. It's what they do. The horror stories tend to be associated with banks who, because the structure is usually different. Normally the airline will have provided some form of security. There may be banks will now be looking at the LTV, loan to value situation, and basically the banks and the lenders have historically been slower to react. I think on here we're showing, one of those sort of horror stories where an aircraft that probably should have been worth about $30 million had engines removed, and in some cases we've even seen landing gears being removed because it's taken so long for the lender to actually get the aircraft protected. And unfortunately, we are in this situation now. Every airline will be looking at every single aircraft in terms of who owns it, which one's got more time on it than others and could be used. And we saw situations in the restructuring of some airlines. I won't name names, but some airlines in the USA, when they were going through some restructuring, basically were kind of a phone call saying your aircraft is parked at airfield X. Tell us when you want to fetch it. And aircraft were basically, the decision on which aircraft were being chosen lay with the airline. They still have an enormous amount of discretion under some of the sort of administration and bankruptcy protection rules. So I think here again there might be some direct financings where banks are directly involved with the airline, but of course it could be where a bank is a lender to a lessor. So in those situations, understanding how the lessor is managing and protecting the loan amount. Lessors have, let's say, borrowed money or used money from several different capital markets. There could be very simple structures, but of course then we have these ABS structures and these sidecar structures where effectively there may be some equity element left in by the lessor, but that potential conflict of interest that there could be at the lessor over prioritizing, which aircraft to take back from an airline or renegotiate terms is something where I think the investors in this particular case, the boards of the ABSs really do need to be asking questions about exactly which aircraft are going to be returned or repossessed. So I think we are sort of coming to the end of our formal presentation. I think we've had several questions coming in. I think as far as we've had some questions about perhaps typical costs or man hours or elapsed time to, I mean, just very generally, Ross, let's say an A320 or a 737 that is going to be put into storage for 3 months. Can you give some sort of indication as to, is that a day's work? Is it a week's work of one person, or that?
The initial entry into storage is where the demand in man hours is initially made. Preparing, lubrication, blanking, disconnecting batteries. Those are the initial tasks which normally would be undertaken by a small team of guys, which may only take a day to get the aircraft into storage. Then you have the ongoing storage, the 7-day, the 14-day, which is renewed. Again, there is working policies in most airlines that a man can't go and work on his own. There needs to be 2 guys together for safety. That was how it practically work in most operators. singling out one aircraft, it is a simple process. Man-hour driven, not many parts, consumables to be used, but the sheer volume of parking fleets is what we need to remember.
Yeah, we had one question here about are there situations where aircraft have to be moved because of an approaching storm? I think, you know, we know that if an aircraft is faced into wind and the wind is strong enough, that's going to create some lift, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the maintenance manual stipulates distances between aircraft as well, nose to tail, as we can all have seen in the news and the press, you know, with the aircraft parked in Hong Kong and Munich. There is a minimum distance because you're going to be carrying out engine runs periodically to maintain the storage program. Obviously, you don't want to damage anything that's parked behind the aircraft during those engine runs. So the simplicity of parking an aircraft has its nuances, which are specified in the manual. Chocking the aircraft, putting wheel chocks in place to stop the aircraft from rolling, specifically during high winds. If we took Heathrow as an example, there'll be a set of chocks on each stand where the passengers are board the aircraft, but the airport doesn't have enough chocks for aircraft parked down taxiways, apron areas. You know, those small practical things are only realised during these times of.
Well, you give me an idea. I might have to call an early end to this meeting and go down and cut a few trees and make some chocks to stop aircraft rolling backwards. So I think that's the second business opportunity that's come around as a result of this call. We've been asked some more general questions about the value issues that are affecting the industry right now. And although we're talking about storage, I think it's probably a useful reminder. We did touch on this last week, that really, as an industry, we as an appraisal industry, we tend to use base value at a time like this, which did come around as a result of the first Gulf War, where, you know, if an aircraft isn't being flown, then clearly it has no value. Does that mean every aircraft is worthless right now? Well, we have to look at the long-term economic value. And this is where the base value definition came in. If you've got more questions on that, please do drop us a line. We can give you a bit more guidance there. There can clearly be an impact on market value, but again, because we've got 33 years of data here, we can provide you with some curves of how markets have recovered in the past. We've been asked questions about engines in particular, because there's a lot of spare engines out there. I mean, is it fair to say that they will already be inhibited anyway and stored, because a spare engine, after all, you're not quite sure when it's going to be used?
Yeah, the off-wing stored engines in most MROs or equipment suppliers are inhibited and preserved in a way that it's a 365-day storage program, which is very simple to renew and continue. So off-wing engines, not really an issue. On-wing engines, making sure they are stored correctly in accordance with the maintenance manual is imperative.
We've been asked again on sort of a broader market point of view, whether this coronavirus will have a more detrimental impact on wide bodies or narrow bodies. I don't think there's any safe haven for an aircraft type at the moment. If we look when we look at the situation in China, first of all, it did affect domestic travel. So if we categorize that as narrow bodies and regional jets and turboprops, they were just as affected as the larger intercontinental wide bodies. I don't think there's any hiding place whatsoever. And I suppose what has made the news over the last few weeks has been the A380, which as a passenger, I think is an awesome aeroplane, but actually, the larger the aircraft in the fleet, the more likely that is to be impacted, because it's just got too much capacity. So we've seen, Lufthansa and Air France, basically saying, they're going to be parking up a significant number of the A380s. And I think it's probably unfair just to single out the A380, because other airlines who don't have A380s, they'd be parking their 777s and 747s. So one, I say, glimmer of hope we had, was about the freight market, because so much of the logistics business relies on passenger aircraft belly freight. Because those aircraft aren't flying, we've seen indications that perhaps some of the freighters are in demand, which was possibly, again, I wish I'd seen that coming, because that's another business opportunity, I suppose. But clearly I say our phone hasn't stopped ringing, because people are saying, how can we assess the risk? We've just updated our airline scores. We've obviously heavily caveated those, because a lot of the financials we were looking at were as at December 31st, and most of those accounts, for example, Cathay actually made a profit last year, despite the issues of pre-coronavirus with unrest. But of course, I think it's note 16 basically says, at time of publishing these results, obviously coronavirus is going to have a huge impact this year. So we still thought it was valid to update our airline scores. But if there are specific airlines that anybody's worried about, then we can do a deeper dive on our operator risk assessment. I think as far as a couple of other conversations we've had is the impact on the spare engine market, because I think there's a view, a lot of investors will look at any leasing company now and say it's under threat. And if you look at the likes of I know the big four publicly listed leasing companies, their share price has dropped. But I think it might be different in the engine leasing sector, because I think when demand does come back, I think it's highly likely that airlines will lease an engine in for a year rather than go spend a few $1 million on an overhaul. Yeah. So there's some seesawing of industry views on that, but I think looking back at previous downturns, the preservation of cash won't be just for now. It's a big slap in the face for everybody right now as to what is really crucial, and cash preservation is top of the list. Yeah. I think as far as that goes, we've got a few other questions, and for those of you who've sent questions in and I haven't addressed, we will get back to you individually. But I'm going to hand back to Mel for some wrapping up.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I think it just leaves me really to say that obviously some very interesting and hopefully helpful and relevant information that we've covered today. Obviously, if you do need any support in this area, please do get in touch. And I think I'll just say thank you to Ross, thank you to Phil, and to everyone for attending today's session. If you have any other questions, please drop us a line. Our contact details are on the slide that you can see on the screen. We will be sending out, as usual, a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to view the recording and to download the slide deck. So on behalf of IBA, Phil and Ross and myself, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.